Hello, I'm Professor McCoy, and today I want to talk about an incredibly controversial topic, but one that's been on my mind and in the news for very different reasons. And that is political assassination as part of justly conducted war. Now, I already know that YouTube is not going to like this, so if you think that this is interesting, useful, an intriguing ethical discussion, do the YouTube algorithm things and like and share and do those sorts of things. Just maybe compensate for YouTube not liking the topic. In any case, I do try not to be swayed by YouTube algorithm things, but I do need to mention it when things like this come up. In any case, I bring this up for two reasons. I'll talk about the sillier reason first before I go into the perhaps more obvious one. And the sillier reason is that as you may have noticed from other videos that have been appearing throughout, on this channel, I've been going back through and reading the Star Wars Expanded Universe. And as you might guess from the title Star Wars, a great deal of it is about warfare and how that is conducted, how it ought to be conducted, how it ought not to be conducted, all of that sort of thing. All of these topics really tend to come up quite a bit in Star Wars. And in particular, I've been just rereading the Fate of the Jedi series, which, again, I have other videos on the topic that have come out and will be coming out, so keep an eye out for those. And one of the major points of the Fate of the Jedi series is what happens when the otherwise legitimate government, in this case the Galactic Alliance or Galactic Federation of Free Alliances, what happens when the leader goes astray, or perhaps even further goes mad, or perhaps even further goes evil? What is a justifiable response to that sort of thing? What can be done? And so this gives rise to the question, is political assassination justified in that case, and is it a just act of war, or is it something else entirely? Now, that's what piqued my interest in the topic, mostly just because every time Natasi Dalla opened her mouth in that series of books, I just... Do it! Kill her! Anyway, but maybe more importantly and more relevantly to you, the viewer, who are not as obsessed with with 20-year-old Star Wars books as I am, 20-ish, is the geopolitical situation that's going on right now in the Middle East. And by right now, I mean basically whenever you're watching this, past, present, or future. Specifically, though, this has come to my attention and the public's attention by the discussion that Senator Ted Cruz had with Tucker Carlson about Iran's attempts, or the Iranian government's attempts to assassinate Donald Trump, and Israel's attempts, and then potentially even the U.S. attempts to decapitate the leadership of Iran, to use common military terminology. In other words, to directly target political leaders on both sides. Now, this is typically against international law and against ordinary norms of warfare, at least modern norms of warfare. But that isn't necessarily an indicator that it is categorically unjust. Now, it may perfectly well be unjust. Like any other act of war, it could be unjust under certain circumstances, but I'm an ethicist. I, as a philosopher, as an ethicist in particular, I want to look at what those circumstances are. And I want to examine, can political assassination ever be an act of just war? And I'd argue that ultimately, under some narrow circumstances, it absolutely can. Okay, so first of all, I want to look at why political assassination is ordinarily outlawed by international law and international norms of warfare. And I want to look at whether this is for ethical reasons or more practical reasons. And then I further want to examine cases in which those reasons would not apply. And then also looking at cases, the more general case of, can it be justified setting aside any international norms or international law? So, first of all, why is it that political assassination is typically a violation of international law, or at least violations of treaty agreements, or norms of modern warfare? Well, the reason should be somewhat obvious, so long as you're thinking in terms of public choice theory. If you're thinking in terms of, if you're thinking simply in terms of abstract considerations of what is the right thing or the wrong thing to do in abstract ethics and at the purely theoretical, a-personal level, it might be harder to tell why that would be unacceptable. And now you can come up with excuses. You can say something like that the commander-in-chief of a nation's military forces is a political and therefore a civilian leader, and so is not an enemy combatant, even though they are directly in charge of the actions of the military. That seems disingenuous, to say the least. And I would argue that it certainly is when those justifications come up. Rather, if you look at it, as I said, from the perspective of public choice theory, that is, with the assumption that state actors have their own interests, that their political actions can serve, and that those motivations matter to what choices they will make, it all starts to be a little bit more clear. Bye, Angel. The reason for that is that if you ask yourself, who is it that agrees upon international norms, international law, norms of warfare, etc., and it is typically civilian leaders who are indirectly in charge of military forces. And of course, like most people, civilian political leaders do not want to die. In fact, they want to avoid being targeted by military strikes or by assassination attempts as much as possible. Like most people, this is a perfectly understandable motivation. And so, if they can conduct a warfare in the modern context without the fear of being targeted for assassination, they will do a lot to ensure that that is how war is conducted. Even if that means withholding a particular act of war from their own repertoire, their own arsenal. In other words, they might agree to refrain from targeting other heads of state and other political leaders in general on the assumption that they themselves will not be targeted by their own enemies in warfare. And so we have heads of state, or politicians in general, moving the level of conflict away from themselves and towards the soldiery, towards armies, towards militaries. And we have military conflicts that are between militaries and militaries. Again, this is not necessarily an outright simple ethical decision. It is a practical decision on the part of the leadership. Now, why would you want to politically assassinate a leader of an enemy state? This can help us to delineate whether or not such an act of political assassination could, in principle, be an act of just war, setting aside those international agreements that are essentially based upon self-preservation. In one case, the reason for targeting a politician in an act of war, so basically for political assassination, the reason could be to inspire political change through fear. For example, if, say, a senator were to be assassinated after they supported an act of war, after they voted for an act of war, or campaigned for it, or what have you, if enemy combatants assassinated that politician, that is going to dramatically decrease the political support for that war on the part of other politicians in a similar position, simply out of fear. That is an act of terrorism, by any definition. The most commonly accepted definition of terrorism is the use of indiscriminate violence or violence against civilians. Those are kind of debatable as to which is the primary definition, but usually it's both. For the purpose of instilling fear in order to effect political change. That is terrorism. So terrorism is indiscriminate violence, so targeting non-combatants, for the purpose of instilling fear in the rest of the population fear of being targeted indiscriminately, and once again, for the purpose of political change, altering the political situation among the target population. In this case, the target population being enemy politicians. Such an act would, of course, be terrorism, which, again, due to its indiscriminate targeting, is necessarily an unjust action. It is not it can never qualify as an act of just warfare. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative, of course, is the same reason that you might target an enemy commander, a military commander. That if, say, a senator, or maybe a president, or a king, or what have you, is conducting a war, whether they're conducting it effectively, and so eliminating them would decrease the effectiveness of the enemy army, or they are among the only ones who would be willing to conduct the war, and you expect that their replacement would be less likely to do so. A regime change war, for example. This is a very common instance, right? A common type of case where this kind of political assassination might be carried out. In the case of, say, a regime change war, that can, under certain narrow circumstances, be justified. If all of the other requirements for a just war are met, if it is a last resort, if there is hope of victory, if it can actually succeed, if it is not aggressive, if it's defensive in nature, if it does not target civilians, etc. If there is a political assassination that would alter the military disposition of the target nation, of the target enemy nation, that could, in principle, be justified. I am going to now completely refrain from drawing any particular implications for modern geopolitics. I think you can do so. You can draw such implications if you'd like. I am in no way saying that there are any particular politicians that it would be just to assassinate. Because, first of all, let's be perfectly clear, I don't think there are any just wars going on right now. Not that I'm aware of, at least. And so again, this is very important to note, any act of political assassination, even if it can be just in and of itself, would still need to be conducted justly as part of a just war. And so this would have to be a defensive action. It would have to be conducted through legitimate means, etc., etc., etc. So, again, why I bring this up is to use a very particular example. So, if we take, going back to the example of Ted Cruz's interview with Tucker Carlson.
Are you now? Because you told me that the government of Iran is presently trying to assassinate Donald Trump, and
that is undisputed. There's literally nobody who disputes that fact.
Why don't you support military action right now against Iran?
We are engaged in military action right now.
Why don't you support offensive military action?
We're bombing the crap out of Israelism. We're supporting them. Israelism.
Okay, so why shouldn't the U.S. military defend its own president? I don't understand that.
If we take Ted Cruz at his word, and we assume that the Iranian government and those in charge of the Iranian government have hired assassins in the U.S. to kill the U.S. president, presumably for the purpose of regime change, for the purpose of avoiding U.S. involvement or U.S. war against Iran or something like this. Again, I don't know if that would be effective, but we can set that aside. By the way, of course, worth noting, if there is no chance or no reasonable chance that that would be effective in stopping an attack, in stopping an unjustified act of war, then of course that action would be unjustified anyway, but I digress. Setting that aside. If that were the case, Tucker Carlson's question becomes quite relevant. Would that not be an act of war? I argue that it absolutely would be. That targeted political assassination against, say, a U.S. president would be an act of war, if that is true. That would be an act of war conducted by Iran. And that would justify a retaliatory response, so long as such a response would stop the attack, is a last resort, etc., following all of the precepts of just war. And so Tucker's question, overstated as it may have been, because I do not think you can come up with a justification based on this for the employment of nuclear weapons, but setting that aside, an attempted assassination of a political leader would qualify as an act of war, and so would, or at least could, justify a just response of either of equivalent methods, that is, targeting political leaders on the other side, or more conventional warfare, if that is the more effective, and if that is the less destructive way of moving forward. That, of course, opens the question of which is the appropriate method, and to make a case for political assassination, regrettably, again, all kinds of specifications here. Not to say that this is almost ever a good idea, and almost certainly not in any present situation, but there are cases, I think, to be made where that a targeted political assassination can be the best option, if it could, in fact, stop a war immediately. If, for example, there is a mad tyrant, right? If there is a single political leader who is taking control of a country, of a territory, of a nation, of a region, whatever, and that they are solely responsible for conducting an unjust war, political assassination could perfectly well be justified, because it could be, first of all, there could be no better way of stopping the war, and doing so could stop the conflict with minimal loss of life, especially of innocent life, innocent civilian life. Now, once again, like most cases of just war, circumstances in which political assassination, or really any other method of warfare, are vanishingly small. Just wars are quite rare, unfortunately. Well, it's unfortunately that so few wars that are conducted justly. It is rather fortunate that there are very few cases where war would be justified. How about that? Nice middle ground, I suppose. But in any case, I do think that this is certainly worth discussing, given, well, first of all, the geopolitical situation of the moment, but more broadly, the geopolitical discussions that are always going on about whether a particular leader is responsible for an act of war, or whether an ongoing conflict can be stopped, and how can it be stopped, and should it be stopped, and should it be stopped justly, and by what means? All of these questions of just war are unfortunately always relevant. So, I hope this has been an interesting, useful discussion. I hope YouTube doesn't hate this video too much, that you're actually able to see it, and I thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.